Joining me now is former Congresswoman Debbie Mucarsel-Powell, who is also the Democratic Florida candidate for the U.S. Senate. Thank you for joining me today. The death toll, let's start there, from Hurricane Milton has risen to 24. Earlier this afternoon, President Joe Biden went to Florida to survey hurricane damage and recovery efforts following Hurricanes Milton and Helene. He visited to St. Pete Beach, where he got a briefing from first responders. He also announced new funding for communities ravaged by the storms. Take a listen.
Today, I'm proud to announce $612 million to 6 new cutting-edge projects to support communities impacted by Hurricane Helene and Milton. This funding will not only restore power, but will make the region's power system stronger and more capable and reduce the frequency and duration of power outages while extreme weather events become more frequent.
What are your thoughts on the president's visit today, Debbie?
Yeah, first of all, good afternoon, Reverend. Look, I've been traveling all across the state. I was in Wellington, an area that was affected by tornadoes on Friday. Yesterday, I was in Fort Myers. Today, I visited Tampa. And the President Biden, gave me a call this morning as I was trying to get to Tampa. And I thanked him. I thanked him for coming to the state of Florida to show Floridians and also the entire country that we need to work together when we are faced with these devastating storms, devastating natural disasters. I'm very grateful for the support, the funding that he's bringing to the state. I think that this is a moment where we really need to pay attention on the leadership that we have in the state. We have to make sure that we have politicians that are able to put politics aside, partisan politics aside, and work together in a coordinated effort, local officials, state officials, and federal officials. And we haven't had that in the state of Florida, unfortunately. Look, Rick Scott, the person that I'm running against, has been spreading disinformation about FEMA funding, which is extremely dangerous, and it puts the lives of many survivors at risk. The families that I have spoken to, I mean, it's heartbreaking to listen to them. Some of them don't even have property insurance. They don't know how they're going to be able to get back up on their feet. And so I had to tell them that FEMA's there especially to support them, to give them that disaster relief. And they're confused because of the disinformation. Rick Scott, of course, is walking around with this Navy hat, but voted against FEMA funding. I mean, he is one of the biggest frauds that we have in the United States Senate. This is a moment that I've become extremely frustrated with, the fact that he's not being truthful with Floridians. We need to make sure that we rebuild with resiliency, that we are truthful to Florida homeowners, that if they're faced again with another storm, they may lose everything again if
Debbie,
we don't.
Let me ask you, you say Rick Scott voted against FEMA funding, and now this is what FEMA's the ones on the ground dealing with this issue. And for many Florida homeowners, the impact of the storms is potentially life-changing. Most home insurance policies don't cover flooding. According to an NBC News analysis, only about a quarter of affected Florida residents have separate flood insurance. Is there a role for Congress to play in helping those who have potentially lost their homes without any compensation? And what are your thoughts on Republican Speaker Mike Johnson's decision not to call the House back into session to address hurricane aid?
It's completely irresponsible, Reverend. I mean, they need to go back to Congress and make sure that they appropriate funding for FEMA. We know from the secretary that she has enough right now for the disasters that we have experienced, but we may need to prepare for the next disaster. I mean, it is irresponsible that they are completely abandoning their post, all for politics. And look, I just met with a small business owner yesterday in an area that was affected by the storm surge of Helene and then Milton. They have yet to recover completely from Hurricane Ian. And he had actually purchased flood insurance, but in that insurance policy, he realized now that storm surge was not included. We need to make sure that insurance companies also are not taking advantage of policyholders, families living in the state of Florida. But also, we have to have that conversation in Congress in a bipartisan fashion to make sure that we expand the national flood insurance risk. We don't have courage from our leaders. We have politicians that are using their seat for self-gain and self-enrichment, like Rick Scott is.
Now, on Wednesday, a federal judge rejected an emergency request to extend voter registration deadline in Florida, which is tomorrow. The request was extended by 10 days due to disruptions caused by these recent hurricanes. The League of Women Voters and of Florida and the Florida chapter of the NAACP filed a lawsuit arguing that the damaging effects from the hurricanes are preventing many residents from registering before tomorrow's deadline. How concerned are you about these storms' possible effect on people's ability to vote in the upcoming election?
Look, of course, it's concerning. We have families here that have lost everything, Reverend. We have lost loved ones because of these storms. And so the last thing that anyone's thinking about is registering to vote. And so that's why we were asking for that extension. I actually made the call for the supervisor of elections, and the courts denied that claim. But the reality is that the Republicans here in the state of Florida are very concerned because the energy on our side is so much greater. People are mobilizing. They're angry and frustrated by the fact that they've done nothing to deal with the impacts of climate change, that they've done nothing to deal with the insurance, that the crisis that we have here. So many homeowners have nothing left and no insurance policies. That's why I need to defeat Rick Scott. And that's why I need everyone watching to support me in this race. DebbieForFlorida.com. I need everyone with me. I am on a statistical tie right now, Reverend. If people come out and vote, and I can tell you that those vote by mail ballots are coming 2-1 in our favor. Independents are coming towards us.
Let me ask you about that Senate race. You mentioned your Senate race. You're currently running against Republican incumbent Senator Rick Scott, who you mentioned. Former President Obama endorsed you earlier this month. Your race is one of just a handful of contests that could decide whether Democrats hold on to the Senate or it flips to Republicans. What is your sense of where things stand in Florida right now?
Reverend, I can tell you that we are tied. I mean, poll after poll is showing me within 1 or 2 points of Rick Scott. There was one outlier poll that shows Scott much more ahead, but I have been traveling the state for a year. This is a state that is a swing state. It's a purple state. And people here are really working to make sure that we get Florida on the right track. I have been overwhelmed by the support, the calls that I received, the messages, independent voters, Republicans who are coming to my events to say, we need good leadership. We need someone that's going to be working for us and not for themselves. And that's why I think that I will be able to defeat Rick Scott, but only if people come out and vote, and only if you contribute and help me in this campaign. DebbieForFlorida.com. And let me just say that endorsement for President Obama was one more thing that I needed to make sure that we get it over the line.
All right, Florida Senate candidate Debbie Mucarsel-Powell, candidate for U.S. Senate in the state of Florida. Thank you for being with us. Before we